going to do a little different talk in that I'm not presenting science, I'm presenting more of a reflection of really being in the heat of the GMO debate in the early 2000s and the mid-2000s, stepping out for a while, doing something completely different, and then stepping back in the last 4 or 5 years in a similar area in synthetic biology. So I just wanted to share with you some of the, what I think were mistakes or traps that happened back then, in order for us to kind of think about how we try and avoid those when we speak about novel technologies, in particular genetic engineering, with respect to reef restoration. So, our approach to engagement really hasn't changed much. I think we still speak about engagement, public acceptance or social acceptance. We now use the sexy word or phrase social license to operate. Back then, 15, 20 years ago, it was public approval. And we're still trying to, or at least we still speak of, doing it for the purpose of either increasing adoption of a particular novel innovation or decreasing opposition to it. Even though we might think of it differently and we want some more intention or some more meaningfulness in the way that we engage, we still don't speak that way. We still use that old language. So the most important thing I wanted to convey to you today is that there are risks with this approach. And myths. So just to the risks first, it encourages, I think, a transactional relationship and a hierarchical one. We always seem to think that science knowledge is the best knowledge, local knowledge is important, Indigenous knowledge is important, but science is always the best and makes decisions based on that knowledge. I also think it assumes that technological innovation is always what's needed, when often we need a combination of institutional innovation as well as technological innovation. But that's often missed when we speak about a social license to operate. Some of the myths that I still hear, and I've heard them very recently, including at this meeting, is that the public is either for or against novel biotechnology applications. That's a mistake. We shouldn't be using that kind of language. It's actually not true. And for those people who are not directly involved, for example, that don't live on the reef, tolerance and ambivalence is kind of more common, particularly as people think about novel biotechnology. Another trap that we still fall into is called the knowledge deficit model of engagement, where we just think that all people need is a little knowledge about the great science that we're doing. And it doesn't work at all. That approach doesn't work. We learned from my colleague Aditi yesterday, it's just so much more complicated than that. Knowledge is just one small part of how we form attitudes. And our approach to actually engaging with the public, if it's prefaced on that type of engagement, actually gives us more grief. Another common, belief that I come across is that procedural fairness, so the way a process is carried out, and institutional trust is not core to science, and it actually belongs to communicators or other intermediaries. I think that's a mistake that we can fall into. I think science is very much responsible for the way that it carries out its processes and its decision-making in particular. So if I just cast your mind back to the early 2000s and the GMO debate back then, there was almost no deliberative engagement, and the engagement that did happen, I was actually part of it. I spent 1 year travelling the countryside, speaking to farmers and consumers and local community groups about the benefits and risks of GMO, particularly in agricultural biotechnology context. It was very much a town hall meeting style. You rock up, you give the expert speech, you get a little Q&A, a little 20 minutes at the end of 3 hours, and that was engagement. Luckily, we think about things differently, but I still think that this type of engagement goes on. I think it's to our detriment as scientists. The benefits back then were largely commercial, and consumers really thought that the risks were directed at them. So it was all about food safety and labelling. Those kinds of arguments were really popular back then. So you get this kind of disengagement happen in terms of what the technology could potentially provide. There wasn't enough, I think, particularly at the community level, a feeling that there was any listening. I'll just point to the last one there. Stereotyping of NGOs as perhaps homogenous entities is something that is very common. Almost always they're militant opponents or enemies of science. Emerging now, I see that there are also militant proponents of science as well. So I think we have to be careful how we speak about potential partners in decision-making about science and its usefulness. So I'm really just focusing on one particular point, and that is engagement, public engagement in particular. So this is not expert stakeholder engagement of the type that you might be more familiar with. This is public engagement, and I wanted to showcase it in a very, just a quick example. It's one slide about how we're trying to do things differently with a carp biocontrol project that you may have heard about yesterday from Dee. So my colleague and I travelled around 3 states, basically along the Murray-Darling Basin, and actually asked people about what they thought of the federal government's plan to biologically control carp using a herpes virus. And really this was a series of focus group discussions and a number of interviews. We really found that people had a very sophisticated understanding of the problem. Which, I mean, it wasn't a surprise, I guess, to us, but it has been a surprise to others that people understood climate variability, people understood the impacts of agricultural activity on the state of Australian waterways. So I think when we think about technology, the lesson here is that don't assume that people have a real simple understanding, but in fact, we've learned quite a bit from speaking, or listening rather, to people on the ground. There's a deep knowledge of local environmental history, particularly in place-based communities, and trust. We always speak about the importance of trust. Well, trust is actually a variable concept. We found a very, very low trust in local councils, so that has an impact on the thought of dealing with a large carp biomass cleanup. There was high trust in SARA, but we're reminded that we're not infallible, which is a good reminder actually. And trust is also kind of mediated by previous biocontrol failures. So what people think about how virus mutates, even like a human influenza virus, for example, really did influence on how they thought about potential biocontrol risks. Okay, so just now stepping and looking at engagement of a different type. I think this is still engagement. People call it science integration. This is about how life scientists engage with social scientists and vice versa, so how we get that discussion going and that transdisciplinarity is, or it's actually interdisciplinarity as people like to refer to it. And I want to use that in the synthetic biology example. So SARO has put forward an investment in synthetic biology future science platform, of which there are a number of application domains you can see there. Maximising impact is the domain that I'm involved with and that my colleague Aditi Mankad leads. It actually has 2 goals. One of them is to gain insights into the drivers of stakeholder attitudes in this type of context. But the other one is to build capability of scientists, so life scientists, to look at social and ethical issues quite early in the piece. So often at the point of quite exploratory basic science phases. So what we did is, across those 4 application domains, had a number of workshops, so half-day workshops, where really 3 social scientists got together in a room full of life scientists and biophysical scientists, and it was really an opportunity for us to learn about how the technology sat in the social world, and for life scientists to understand some of the social impacts of the kind of technology that they worked on. So some of the lessons to come from that, and you can see on the left there, that's a systems map that was actually generated in 20 minutes by people who said that they've never done any systems thinking at all. So it was actually quite an encouraging process. One of the lessons I wanted to share with you is that the mutual learning has really helped us build rapport. So now, as social scientists, we might understand what the technology actually is and where it sits in the world, and vice versa. Just been given a 2 minute, it's probably 1 minute now. I've got 2 slides. This is one way to think about ethics and social science with regards to novel biotechnologies. It's a simple way, it's done often. You look at impact as concerns, you talk about harms, benefits and risks and consequences, and over to the right there you've got in principle concerns, and often people think that that's the really hard stuff, the intractable, unresolvable objections, plain God objections, naturalness arguments and so forth. That's an easy way to look at the problem. I actually think it's much more nuanced, and I think we need to start using some of this language, or at least start to think about the system. I tried not to use that word again, but I did, in terms of the broader environment in which these concepts play out. So it really, how do we want the public to participate in science and science decision making? What do we mean by science integration? It's not just a bunch of life scientists sitting in a room, social scientists, and hoping to get along. It doesn't work like that. What does responsible conduct of science mean? How does partnering fit in all of this? So I think it's much more complicated. I don't have the answers to this for you. This is my last slide. Lessons from the last couple of decades. Really, what happened back then was an overstating of the benefits and a kind of an exaggeration of the risks. And one of my jobs as a philosopher back then was to kind of temper the arguments that were going back and forth. Isolating discussions about the novel technology from other innovation opportunities. Technology is one tool among many tools, and it is likely, and we've heard that this morning and over the last couple of days, that it's probably going to be just one contributor to the problem, to the solution. Making broad assumptions, some of that's quite clear. And the last one, dismissing community concerns as irrational, irrelevant, or illegitimate, thank you, is unhelpful. It's actually, in my opinion, very disrespectful, and it's just plain wrong. It just doesn't get us anywhere. Okay, thank you very much.